Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mabardi. We are recording this today, Monday, February 12th, of course, the day after the Super Bowl. So that is going to be the plan for today, talking all things NFL and Super Bowl, of course, game points of this, but also some of the aftermath stuff as well. I'm sure we'll be talking a lot about this game and the ramifications of it a lot in the coming week. Today we are going to be starting with just the general reactions and points on the game itself. Then in the second segment, we're going to be moving on to a Chiefs-centric conversation, talking about whether or not this officially marks the beginning of the dynasty for the Chiefs. And then in the third segment, we'll talk about what it looks like for this group going forward now. So we will be getting into all of that before finally wrapping up the show, talking some Kyle Shanahan, because he's sort of the big name that's being thrown around, especially with a report that came out earlier today. So we will be talking about Shanahan, his legacy, and all things surrounding that. But before we get into the show today, just a reminder, if you are watching on YouTube, to like and subscribe. Helps us out a lot. And for any of our live viewers here, just a reminder to use the link streaming in the bottom ticker. That is streamelements.com/gsmcsportsnetwork./tip for any comments or any considerations. And for anybody tuning in as well, just a reminder to use the live chat to help make this show as interactive as possible. But getting into our first topic here, talking about just reactions to this Chiefs victory. They come out on top, come back from a little bit of an early deficit, and then pull it off with a walk-off touchdown in the waning moments of the overtime period to win 25-22. This was just the second overtime game in Super Bowl history, so a little bit of a monumental feat in that. Interestingly enough, 49ers head coach Kyle Shanahan has now been present in both of these overtime games, with the Falcons-Patriots one coming earlier in the mid-2010s, 2016, I believe it was. And it was the Niners, yet again, in this matchup, coming out on top. I know that they are coming out fast, I should say. Definitely not on top. But, a little bit of a role reversal from what's been going on up to this point in this current playoffs, but similar to the 49ers and Chiefs matchup the last time they faced off in the Super Bowl, where the Niners were able to get off to a bit of a lead. They scored the first 10 points of the game. And no, this wasn't quite as dramatic of some of Mahomes' previous comebacks in terms of making up so much ground in the second half. But this did mark the third Super Bowl where Mahomes has come back while trailing by at least 10. He is yet to lead at halftime at a Super Bowl, and yet he's now 3-1 in the big game. And he, of course, had the two crucial drives at the end of regulation, and then, of course, in overtime to tie the game in regulation, send it to overtime, and then the game-winning drive. And, I thought that it was really interesting this time around, because Mahomes, obviously, based off of the talent alone and his now enhanced understanding of the game as well, that him as the quarterback, you don't expect, pretty much at these moments, I think we all knew that he was going to go down the field and score on both these drives, but there was a little part of me that was sort of thinking back to, everybody talks about the scripts, of course, the NFL script, and I thought that it almost would have been a little poetic going back to, and maybe it still is, the fact that they were able to come up here, but going back to NFL opening night where the Chiefs and the Lions played, and it was a similar moment where the Chiefs had an opportunity to score late in the game and continue to make this a game, and their receivers just totally sold Mahomes out. Kadarius Toney, of course, sort of the dialogue surrounding him starting on that opening night. And throughout the regular season, there were a few chances they had to sort of rectify this, and they didn't really. They didn't trail and end up scoring a game-winning drive in regulation under these circumstances all year. And now they are, just the way that this offense came together over the course of the year. And I think that it speaks a lot to the leadership of Patrick Mahomes. And, there was a moment where Marquez Valdes-Scantling late in the game, he had about a 5 or so yard gain after a completion. He breaks the tackle, runs backward, and loses 4 yards. And the very next play, Pat Mahomes goes right back to him because he knows he needs all hands on deck. And he needs to make sure that all of his players are engaged and feeling the best they can. So, not a massive moment in terms of necessarily the results of this game, but I do think that it sort of speaks to Mahomes and his understanding of the game, yes, but also understanding what the game calls for and all of that, but also understanding now all of these emotional and sort of outside of just football alone things that come into the game and come into be a factor, and he's sort of on top of it more now. And maybe this one set of plays is me giving a little too much praise, but I couldn't help but notice that this is just something Mahomes, he obviously voiced a lot of frustration earlier in the year, maybe not directly at his receivers, but he was struggling probably more than we've ever seen him struggle since entering the NFL in terms of, the not even confidence. It was more so confidence in his guys, and he was really feeling sort of the struggles of a little bit of that departure of a true number one receiver, especially when Kelsey wasn't necessarily himself. He was dealing with a little bit of injuries as well, so it wasn't exactly a great sequence in that middle stretch of the season when they were really struggling, but he was able to sort of be the leader he needed to rectify the situation and bring everybody together for, again, almost in a poetic way, coming up in these very similar circumstances to their first game of the year, the first NFL game of the year, in which they came up short. So, I thought that Mahomes was really impressive down the stretch, of course. Now, this is the Chiefs pulling it off and becoming the first repeat champions since the 2003-2004 Patriots, led by, of course, at that time, Tom Brady, which is just sort of another check mark almost. We're going to get into a little bit the Mahomes legacy thing. I still think it comes down to longevity and continued greatness and all of that. But if you are making the argument for Mahomes being the greatest of all time, I think that repeating is something in the NFL that in my entire lifetime, essentially, it hasn't been done. Just that Patriots team where I wasn't even old enough to watch it at the time. So I've always sort of operated under the idea that repeating is just not something that happens in the NFL because of the amount of parity and the amount of roster turnover from coaching staff to players that happens on a year-to-year basis. It's just so hard to maintain that continued success, and led by the greatest quarterback in the league and just about the best coach in the league in Andy Reid, they were able to do so, which was very much a similarity. I think that it is just a positive note for this continued building resume for Patrick Mahomes. This was a great game. I know it started out a little bit slow in terms of, maybe the superstar action that we were expecting. We had some turnovers and a little bit unforced turnovers. I mean, they're fumbles. It's obviously a part of the game, but, it just sort of, it's not what you expect to see, just such high level play for things to sort of go wrong like that. But, the last 2.5 periods, you can say, considering overtime as well, were incredible. Mahomes led a field goal drive right before the end of the half, and from that point on, it was a one-score game all the way throughout. Now, I know that Kyle Shanahan is going to get a lot of negativity following this game. I'm going to be doing a segment on him myself, but I think that it is really hard to say that anyone in particular choked this game because, again, it was neck and neck the whole time. The 10-point lead for the 49ers was just in the second quarter, so I know people are going to aggregate this and say, oh, well, here's Shanahan blowing another 10-plus point lead in the Super Bowl, even though, again, in the second quarter, I don't think that that really counts. Nobody thought that was insurmountable at any given time. And I just don't think that it can really count towards a slew of blown leads for Shanahan. Now, do I think Shanahan had a great game himself? No, I don't. And we're going to be getting into some of those concerns. But again, I think also just putting it entirely on the shoulders of Shanahan and marking it up as another example of a greater picture. Now, I know it will happen, and it definitely doesn't help his overall legacy, of course, but again, I just sort of hesitate with the full blame there. Now, it was actually special teams, again, a thing where it's kind of hard to really blame anyone in particular. It's almost a cliche at this point, especially over the course of the past few seasons, talking about, well, special teams is the third phase of the game, and everybody sort of looks down on it. It's not supposed to be as important, and yet time and time again, we see how crucial it actually ends up being in these big moments, and it ultimately was the downfall of the 49ers, in my opinion, between the Kansas City Chiefs punt that went off the leg of Luter, I think his name was, on the 49ers, that gave the Chiefs a red zone possession that they scored on the first play out of it in on a Mahomes touchdown pass to give them their first lead of the game. And then the other big special teams play was Jake Moody's PAT getting blocked after the Niners scored in the fourth quarter. Now, it's hard to blame him either as far as a choking argument because, I mean, he hit a then Super Bowl record longest field goal in Super Bowl history with a 55-yarder early in the second quarter. Now, Harrison Butker on the other end ended up breaking that, but he also had another 50-yard field goal that the possession after getting blocked on this PAT, and I think that sort of takes guts for a rookie kicker such as Moody, who, wasn't necessarily kicking the best he has all year down the stretch of the year, missed a bad field goal in the Green Bay game, comes out and drills this 53-yarder in a massive moment for them. And, of course, the blocked PAT does allow the Chiefs to tie the game at the end of regulation with a field goal instead of a touchdown. But, again, I think that trying to pin this all on Moody as well, was it a great kick? No. But they also, it felt like, maybe not on this play in particular, but in overtime and in some of these other instances, they were having to lean on him a lot. And I think that, it's just hard when you're putting so much on the kicker. It's because with all the talent on that offense, and obviously the Chiefs defense is great, and we'll be getting more into that as well, but I think that it sort of goes to show, like, the 49ers offense wasn't really able to punch it in the way that they should have. They had 2 opportunities off of turnovers that they were unable to capitalize on. The Chiefs offense, like we mentioned, started out as slow as they did, but the Niners weren't really able to get anything going. Their offensive line, I thought, had a really rough day. They were putting themselves in a lot of third and long situations, the false starts. They really, and again, we'll go more into this in depth during the Shanahan and 49ers segment, but everybody wanted them to run the ball more with Christian McCaffrey. It's like, yeah, just keep running the ball. But Christian McCaffrey had 22 carries, and Elijah Mitchell had a handful of carries himself as well. It's not like they were gouging the Chiefs on the D-line, which I think, goes to show, again, just how good Steve Spagnuolo is, winning his 4th Super Bowl, these 3 with the Chiefs, but he also won with the Giants in the 2010s. But, this is what we talked about on the show all last week, is that Spagnuolo and that defense are going to be prepping for McCaffrey in the run game, because that's where they're most susceptible, and that is the Niners' best weapon, in my opinion. And again, McCaffrey finishes with 80 yards. He finishes with something like 130 plus if you can add in the receiving yards as well. So he was effective, but he wasn't, incredibly efficient, and he was good, and he's a great player. But I thought that the Chiefs defense did a really good job of taking that out. And ultimately, it came down to Patrick Mahomes, as it always sort of seems to do, and him versus another quarterback, and Purdy, who I thought was fine. I thought he was good for most of the night. I don't think it's tough, because I don't know how much he really, if you came into this game thinking that Purdy isn't a franchise guy and he doesn't have enough to lift a team, then you're probably feeling about how you did going into the game. If you were a Purdy defender, you can very easily make an argument that he did just about everything he could have and everything he was asked of. He didn't get a lot of help from his offensive line, and the run game wasn't quite as dominant as it maybe should have been. But again, it's going to be interesting, because I don't think that we really have anything answered when it comes to Purdy, and I think that that's also sort of a bigger point of, it's so hard to just judge a player off of one game, and that's what we always seem to do when it comes to the playoffs, but that's just not really how this whole thing works. So, Purdy's still going to have the same doubters probably going into next year. I think that more importantly for him, he probably has the trust of the front office, not necessarily just based off of this game alone, but just based off of bringing his team to this position and not being the reason for them to lose. But he wasn't the reason that they won. Patrick Mahomes was. And we're talking about the best quarterback in the league, the best quarterback of his generation. So it's not a surprise, but we saw it last year with him versus Hurts. He was just that much better, and the same sort of came into play in this game as well. And it gets really interesting just thinking about this whole big Chiefs picture, where they go from here. And that's what we're going to be getting into in the next segment after we take this quick break. So stick with us, and we will be right back.